H. Nigel Thomas was born in Dixon in St. Vincent. He moved to Montreal in 1968. He's a retired professor of literature and the author of 6 novels, 3 collections of short fiction, 2 collections of poems, 2 academic books, and scores of essays. He has twice been shortlisted for the Hugh McLennan Fiction Award. Nigel has received the Jackie Robinson Professional of the Year Award, Laval University's Hommage au Créateur, Black Theatre Workshop's Martin Luther King Junior Achievement Award, and the Quebec Writers Association Judy Mappin Community Award.
I'm H. Nigel Thomas. I will be reading an excerpt from my novel Behind the Face of Winter. It was published in 2001. The section attempts to get into the consciousness of a 5-year-old whose mother has left for Canada and who is threatened by the fear of starvation. The setting is actually Sion Hill, except that I've put Sion Hill in Cane Garden. The novel itself is really about the challenges Black children face in the Canadian school system, but it begins in the Caribbean. In the novel, St. Vincent is modified into another country that's called Isabella Island. I wrote it a decade after I had been an activist on behalf of Black children in the school system. A Saturday in 1965, when I was 5 years old, Grandma, Ma, and I were driven to the airport, a long stretch of asphalt on the other side of the hill on which we lived, where a bamboo placed across the highway stopped the traffic whenever planes were alighting or taking off. Ma cried before boarding the plane, and Grandma, wiping her eyes with a white kerchief, her head wrapped in a blue and red plaid one, cried too, and said she would probably never see Ma again in this life. Two foolish people, I thought. If they wanted to see each other, why then was Ma leaving? I didn't say it because whenever I stated my thoughts, they said I was rude. I'd already concluded that children weren't supposed to think, and so I didn't want them to know that I was thinking. A few weeks later, Grandma received a letter from Ma. Grandma sent me a short way up the hill to call Brother Shiloh, who read it aloud to us. Ma said she'd arrived safely. She hadn't yet found a job, but several people she knew were helping her to find one, including Louisa, whose rich mother, Mrs. Manley, lived in a big pink house on the bank above us. She said that for reasons Grandma would understand, her name was now Millicent Brady, not Isis Moore. Ma get married? I asked Grandma. Because when Big Bottom Shirley Brown got married and everybody threw rice at her, which fowls from all around came to eat, Grandma and everyone else started calling her Mistress Yearwood, and I figured it was because she was married to Yearwood. Wagging his finger and brandishing a machete, Yearwood had told Saul, "She's my woman now, so keep your dirty looks to yourself, else so help me God, I will break every single foul bone in your ass." No, your mother don't get married. Stop asking me stupid questions. So I didn't know why my mother's name had changed. I began to wonder too if I would be able to recognize her if I saw her. I'd heard Grandma and Mrs. Duncan talking about a man who had turned into a woman after he left Mount Olivet. I hoped my mother wouldn't turn into a man and wondered why strange things happened to the people when they went to live across the sea. Before Ma left for Canada, I'd already known that the food Grandma went down the hill in Hanover Town to buy was money was with money my mother brought home when she came every Saturday evening before leaving again on Sunday evening. Why Ma always leaving and only coming back on Saturday? 'Cause she have to work. Why? You will feed us? For 3 Saturdays after Ma left for Canada, Grandma bought no chicken. All of the first week, there was no fish or flesh of any kind. Friday morning, before I left for school, Grandma sent me up to Brother Shiloh's wife to beg for a cup of sugar and to borrow 25 cents. On the way home, I was to buy bread from Mrs. Bibby with the money. Sister Shiloh gave me a bag with a pound of sugar, a pound of flour, a pound of rice, and $1 to take back to Grandma. Her face round, black, and smiling, dough on her fingers, which she wiped on a red apron she was wearing. She said, "Tell Ma more, I say she don't owe me nothing. We all got to help one another stay above water." "God make mouth and he provide bread," Grandma said when she heard Sister Shiloh's message. Wednesday of the next week, I had finished looking over my reader, as Miss Bonnie had told us to do when we got home. I knew all the lessons by heart. I even made up my own stories about Miss Tibbs and Mr. Grumps. Mr. Grumps wanting to marry Miss Tibbs, and Miss Tibbs thinking Mr. Grumps too ugly. What would their children look like? After all, Miss Tibbs was a goat and Mr. Grumps a pig. I noticed that Grandma hadn't lit the primer stove. Usually, just as the sun was disappearing from behind the Hanover Town hills, we would be eating. The sun was already doing that, and Grandma was still sitting on the setting. At noon that day, I had had a bun and a cup of lemonade. It was mild to and from school. I was usually hungry by the time I got back to school. I'd learned, since I was about 3, to keep my hunger to myself, because whenever I said I was hungry, Grandma would ask me if I wanted her to steal to feed me. One time she said that people who weren't satisfied with what they had ended up in prison. Such people wanted to fly in the face of God. And since God sent people he was angry with to hell, I didn't want God to get angry with me. Another time, it was the last time I ever complained, Grandma had slapped me. Then, holding me by the hand, she had taken me up the corner shop and asked Mrs. Bibby to credit her some crackers until the following Saturday. Mrs. Bibby said Grandma's bill was too high already and that Grandma had to pay it off before she could get any more credit. Grandma pointed to me and said that I was hungry. Mrs. Mrs. Bibby said if she gave credit to all the hungry people in the world, she would go out of business. "You's wusser than a dog," Grandma told her. "But I is top dog, and it's you that want credit, and I want have it credit to give. Get out my shop." From that time, I never told Grandma I was hungry, and if she asked me if I was, I'd bow my head. So that late afternoon, terror gripped me. When it got dark, Grandma lit the kerosene lamp, gave me a glass of water, and told me to go to bed. I now slept on the cot, which used to be my mother's bed whenever she had her day off, up from the floor, before I slept on rags. I knew what was happening. I'd heard Grandma say many times that people give you when you ask once, but if you keep going back, they get tired of you. Later, when Grandma thought I was asleep, she stood over me and prayed aloud, "Lord, what going to happen to this child? I's old and on my way out of this world. Please, God, don't make this child suffer." Next morning, Grandma killed one of 3 laying hens she kept in a coop behind the house and exchanged half of it with Mrs. Duncan for rice and other things. She made rice soup, which I ate for breakfast, lunch, and supper that day. That afternoon, when I came home, Grandma wasn't there, and Mrs. Duncan, whose house was on the lot beside ours going towards Hanover Town, told me that Grandma said I was to remain at her place until she returned. "Where you went to?" I asked her when she returned at dusk. "None of your business." I was silent. Later, she said, probably realizing that she needed to solicit my cooperation, "I'd been to look for work." I knew that at her age, she was in her mid 60s, she shouldn't be working. I was silent and guilty because I knew I hadn't succeeded in hiding my hunger, and that had made Grandma go out to find work. I wanted to ask her if she'd found work and who would take care of me. For me, work for women was leaving on Sunday evening and returning the following Saturday evening. "You don't want to know if I find a job?" As it turned out, she'd found a job for both of us. That question too broke down the question barrier, for although sometimes she'd say children should be seen and not heard, or you is too inquisitive, more often than not she was glad I asked her questions. In her youth, and even after my mother's birth, Grandma had been the laundress and housekeeper at the Linton's great house. One of the Linton boys, she said, had always been partial to her. He was now a lawyer and married with two children. She had gone that day to find out whether he needed someone to do the laundry. She later found out that he had taken the job away from someone else so she could have it. Poor people always have to fight one another for the bones white people don't want, was all she said when she found out the truth. The highway Mr. Linton drove in on into town passed in front of our house. He dropped the soil laundry off on Mondays and picked up the laundered clothes on Thursdays. Grandma got two large drums, which I had to fill with water on Saturdays. It took several trips to the standpipe, which was about 150 feet away. She used the tailor's goose to iron the clothes, and whenever charcoal was scarce, it became my job to go up into the villages and the hills above Hanover town in search of it. She continued to do laundry right up to the time I left for Canada, at which point there was electricity in the house and tap water in the yard and in the shed at the back that served as a shower. My mother had sent money to do all this and to add two more rooms to the original two rooms of the house. One room became a kitchen and the other was my bedroom. By the time I was 7, Grandma had begun discussing almost everything with me. She said that my mother had gone to Canada illegally, which meant that the police were looking to pick her up and send her home. She had borrowed $1,500 on the land to pay Ma's travels expenses. The bank had to be repaid before we could eat. Otherwise, the bank would seize the land and house, and we would have to live in the street. I didn't need an explanation because earlier that year, accompanying Grandma to the annual missionary meeting, I had on the way back noticed the beggars under the gallery of the hardware store. I asked Grandma why they were there, and she said they had no place to go. What they do when rain falls? They get wet. Grandma told me when I said my prayers before sleeping and upon waking, I was to beg God to keep the police from finding my mother. Each night and morning, I did just that. For about 3 years after those crucial first weeks, there was food. Very little meat and fish, but food in the house. Mrs. Duncan sometimes pretended to need me for some errand, but it was usually to give me something nourishing, a hard boiled egg, a slice of cheese, or a glass of milk. Your grandmother is a proud woman. Don't tell she I giving you nothing to eat, you know. My mother even sent a package with a burgundy dress and a pink house coat for Grandma, some stockings for Mrs. Duncan, and two pairs of long pants, two shirts, a pair of dress shoes, and a pair of running shoes for me. I became one of the 50 or so students who didn't go to school barefooted. What a relief not to have to walk barefooted on the asphalt at lunchtime. I often hear stories of people walking barefoot on fire. They should try Hanover Town's asphalt at midday. About 3 years after my mother's departure, the bank had been repaid, and Grandma was able to spend the money Ma sent instead of turning it all over to the bank. 6 months later, I outgrew all my clothes and began to be top in my class, which prompted Grandma to say, "Good, you got brains. It will get you far if you have the will for use it and control it." Thank you very much.